Get out of here right now! You broke nobody!
The ballroom was alive with the sound of clinking glasses and easy laughter when the double doors at the far end swung open. Warm chandelier light spilled across the marble floor, and for a moment, no one paid attention to the woman who stepped quietly through the entrance. She wore a simple navy dress, the kind you could find at any department store on a Tuesday afternoon. No jewelry worth mentioning, no designer logo stitched along the hem. She carried only a white envelope tucked beneath one arm, and a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper. She paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with the unhurried calm of someone who had spent a lifetime walking into spaces that were not yet ready for her. Her eyes moved past the ice sculptures, past the towering floral arrangements, past the round tables dressed in white linen, and settled briefly on the dance floor before she took a single step forward. That was when Richard Caldwell saw her. He was not the kind of man who missed things. In 40 years of building his real estate empire, Richard had trained himself to read a room in seconds, to assess worth and belonging with the efficiency of a man who had built something from very little and intended to keep it. He stood near the entrance with a champagne flute in one hand, and the easy posture of a man who owned not just the room, but the idea of the room. He took in the woman's navy dress, her flat shoes, the plain envelope, the absence of anything that signaled she belonged in a ballroom like this one, on a night like this one, among people like these. His jaw tightened. He set his champagne flute down on the nearest table with a precise, deliberate click. What almost no one in that room understood, what Richard Caldwell could not have known, even if he had tried, was that the woman in the navy dress had built something he could not have imagined. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She was 51 years old, the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Technologies, a company currently valued at just over $43 billion, with offices on 4 continents and a workforce of nearly 12,000 people. She had been profiled in 3 major business publications in the past 2 years alone. She had turned down a cabinet appointment, a university presidency, and more speaking invitations than her assistant could track. She drove herself to work in a silver sedan she had owned for 6 years. She had no bodyguard. She wore no watch that cost more than $120. She kept these things not because she was making a statement about wealth, but because she had learned long ago that the things people used to signal power were rarely the things that created it. Evelyn had built Meridian from a single rented office above a laundromat in Chicago. She had written the first lines of code herself. She had made the first 50 sales calls herself. She had slept on a cot in that office for 2 winters because the commute home felt like a luxury she could not afford. Now, 23 years later, her company's software ran the supply chain operations of hospitals, logistics firms, and government agencies across 16 countries. She had never stopped working the way she worked in that rented office above the laundromat. That was, more than anything else, why people who worked for her would have walked through fire to keep her trust. Daniel Carter was one of those people. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with the kind of focused energy that made junior colleagues nervous and senior executives take notice. He had joined Meridian 7 years ago as a mid-level project coordinator, and within 18 months, Evelyn had pulled him directly into her division. She had seen something in him early, a stubbornness about getting things right, a willingness to absorb failure without excuses, a talent for building trust in rooms full of skeptics. She had mentored him quietly, the way she did everything, without fanfare, without the self-congratulation that surrounded mentorship in most corporate cultures. She simply gave him harder problems and watched what he did with them. 3 years ago, Daniel had saved a critical infrastructure project that had been on the verge of catastrophic collapse. The client had been ready to pull out. The losses would have reached 9 figures. Daniel had worked 17 days without a proper night's sleep, rebuilt the team's confidence, renegotiated the delivery timeline, and brought the project home. After it was over, Evelyn had called him into her office, closed the door, and told him that she intended to make him a vice president before he turned 36. She had also told him something else, that she considered him not just a valuable employee, but someone she was proud to have helped shape. Daniel had not cried in front of her, but it had been a near thing. When Daniel had asked her, months later, if she would attend his wedding, Evelyn had declined. She did not like the attention that came with her presence at personal events. She did not enjoy the way a room shifted when someone introduced her. She had learned that people stopped being themselves when they found out who she was, and she was tired of watching people stop being themselves. She had sent a warm response through her assistant, expressing her congratulations and promising a gift. But something had changed in the week before the wedding. She had been reviewing Daniel's personnel file in preparation for his official promotion announcement, and she had come across a note he had written 3 years ago during the worst week of the infrastructure project, a handwritten note tucked into the back of a progress report that said simply, "If this fails, it's on me, not the team." She had read it twice. Then she had made a decision. She would go. She would not announce herself. She would simply go, the way you go to something that matters, without making it about you. She had driven herself to the Hartwell Grand Hotel on a Saturday evening in October, parked her silver sedan in the guest lot between a black Mercedes and a catering van, and walked across the stone courtyard toward the entrance with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had nowhere else she needed to be. She had dressed simply, deliberately, not in defiance of expectation, not to prove a point, but because simplicity was what she trusted. The navy dress was one she had worn to 3 other occasions in the past 2 years, and found comfortable in the way that reliable things are comfortable. She carried no statement piece, no signal of arrival. She was simply arriving. She had not called ahead. She had not told Daniel. The plan was simple. Hand him the envelope, congratulate him, and leave before the fish course. It was a good plan. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. Richard Caldwell covered the distance between them in 6 long strides. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair swept back from a face that had spent too many years in the Florida sun. He had the look of someone accustomed to the satisfaction of being the most important person in any room he entered. He planted himself in front of Evelyn with the flat authority of a man used to closing doors. His eyes moved over her again, slowly. The way people look at things they have already decided they understand. "This is a private event," he said. His voice was loud enough that the nearest cluster of guests turned to look. Evelyn met his gaze without hurry. "I was invited," she said. "I'm a guest of Daniel Carter." Richard's expression did not change. If anything, it settled into something harder. "Daniel's guests were confirmed weeks ago," he said. "I don't know who you are, but this is a formal reception. There is a dress code." He said the last sentence the way people say things they know are cruel and have decided to say anyway. The nearest guests had gone quiet. A woman in a gold sequined gown leaned slightly toward her companion. 2 men near the bar turned from their conversation. Someone, somewhere in the room, had already lifted a phone. Evelyn kept her voice level. "If you'd like to call Daniel, I'm happy to wait." "I don't need to call anyone," Richard said. He stepped closer. A deliberate invasion of space, the kind of move designed to make someone back up. Evelyn did not back up. "I know every guest at this wedding. I approved every name on that list. And your name is not on any list I have ever seen." He paused, letting the room hear what he said next. "If you need money, there are services for that. This is not the place." Someone laughed, a short, nervous sound, from somewhere in the middle of the room. A few more phones came out. Evelyn stood very still. There was a quality to her stillness that was different from passivity. It was the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up to it. She shifted the envelope slightly in her hand and said, quietly, "Please ask Daniel to come to the door." "I will not," Richard said. His voice had gone up. He was performing now, and he knew it, and he had committed to it. "I will ask you, one more time, to leave this property before I have security remove you." A security guard had materialized near the entrance, a young man in a black jacket who looked profoundly uncomfortable with the situation he had been summoned into. He stood a few feet back, waiting for a signal. Evelyn looked at him briefly, then back at Richard. "Sir," she said, "I don't want to disrupt your son's wedding. I simply want—" "He is my daughter's husband," Richard said sharply, "and you will not embarrass this family by standing here demanding entry like you belong here." The word belonging landed with the precise weight he intended it to carry. Several guests flinched. A few looked away. The woman in the gold sequined gown had stopped leaning toward her companion and was now staring at the floor. Evelyn's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. She opened her mouth to speak again. And that was when Richard Caldwell raised his hand. It happened in a fraction of a second, the motion, the contact, the sound. A flat, open palm strike across the left side of her face. The crack of it cut through every conversation in the room. The white envelope fell from beneath her arm and landed on the marble floor. The small wrapped gift tumbled after it. For one suspended moment, the entire ballroom held its breath. The chandeliers seemed to dim. The music from the quartet had stopped, or perhaps it had already stopped. No one could remember afterward. Evelyn did not fall. She had not flinched before the blow, and she did not cry out after it. She stood where she had been standing, one hand rising slowly to touch the side of her face, her expression shifting into something that was not anger, exactly, and not hurt, exactly, but something older and quieter than either of those things. She looked at Richard Caldwell, the way you look at a fact you already knew was true. She bent down and picked up the envelope. She picked up the gift. She straightened. She did not say a word. The silence in that ballroom was the loudest thing most of those guests had ever heard. It had a texture to it, thick, close, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. No one moved. A waiter near the back door was holding a tray of champagne flutes, and he was absolutely still, as if motion itself had become dangerous. The string quartet had stopped playing, though no one could recall the exact moment the music had ceased. It was simply gone, the way certain things are gone before you have had the chance to notice them leaving. Richard stood with his hand still half raised, breathing hard through his nose. He had expected her to react, to shout, to collapse, to give him something to work with. Her composure was so complete that it disoriented him. He lowered his hand. He looked around the room, seeking the validation of familiar faces. Most of them had turned away. The security guard had taken 3 steps backward. The woman in the gold-sequined gown had put her phone down. No one was laughing now. From somewhere deep inside the hotel, down a corridor lined with the sound of string music and the clatter of a catering kitchen, a door burst open. Daniel Carter had been in the middle of taking a photograph with his new in-laws when one of the hotel staff had appeared at his elbow, face pale, voice barely above a whisper. He had not caught the whole sentence. He had caught enough. He had handed his champagne glass to the nearest person, without looking at who it was, and walked quickly through the corridor, then faster, and then he was running, his formal shoes snapping against the marble, his tie coming loose, and he pushed through the double doors into the entrance foyer and stopped. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The woman standing near the entrance with a white envelope in her hands and a faint mark along her left cheekbone was Evelyn Brooks, his CEO, the person who had changed the entire trajectory of his professional life. She was standing in the middle of his wedding reception in a room full of 230 people, holding herself with the perfect, unshakable dignity of someone who had decided, long before this moment, that she would not be diminished by it. Miss Brooks. His voice came out barely above a breath. Every head in the room turned. The air shifted. 230 people recalibrated in the span of a single second. Evelyn looked at him, and for just an instant, something crossed her face relief, or something close to it, or perhaps simply the recognition of a person she trusted in a room that had, until this moment, contained no one she trusted. "Daniel," she said quietly, "congratulations." Daniel crossed the floor in long, rapid strides. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face at the mark along her cheek, and his expression did something complicated and painful that he could not fully control. He turned and looked at his father-in-law. Richard Caldwell had gone the color of old paper. His champagne flute was still on the table where he had set it. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for the first time that evening, like a man who understood that something irreversible had happened. "Dad." The word came from Sophia, Daniel's new wife, who had appeared at the edge of the room in her wedding dress, her eyes moving between her father and this woman she had never seen before, with the look of someone assembling a picture from fragments that did not yet make sense. What did you do? Richard's mouth opened. He said nothing. Daniel turned back to face the room. He had spent 7 years learning to speak clearly under pressure in boardrooms, in crisis situations, in conversations with regulators and executives and skeptical clients. He had never needed that skill more than he needed it right now. He said, loudly enough for every person in that ballroom to hear, "This woman is Evelyn Brooks. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Technologies. She is my boss. She is my mentor. And she is the reason I have the career, and frankly the life, that allowed me to have this wedding at all." He paused. She was invited. By me. Personally. The ballroom remained very quiet. Someone near the back set down a fork. Richard Caldwell's face had moved through several expressions in the past 30 seconds. Shock, embarrassment, a flicker of something that might have been defiance and had settled, finally, into something that looked like the beginning of genuine fear. Not the fear of physical danger, the fear of what he had done and what it meant, arriving all at once. Evelyn raised one hand slightly, not quite a gesture, more like the implication of one. "It's all right, Daniel," she said. "It is not all right," Daniel said. He said it gently, but without any softness. The envelope in Evelyn's hand was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind used for legal documents and formal correspondence. She had carried it from her car with the same care she gave to everything she decided was worth her attention. Inside it were 3 things: a share certificate in Daniel Carter's name, representing a significant equity stake in Meridian Technologies, a formal letter of appointment to the position of Senior Vice President of Global Operations, and a personal note in Evelyn's handwriting that said, among other things, that she considered the work he had done over the past 7 years to be among the finest she had witnessed in her career. She had been planning to hand it to him quietly, in a corner, the way she preferred to do things. She had been planning to congratulate him and slip away before anyone noticed she had been there. None of that was going to happen, the way she had planned it. The executives from Meridian who had come as Daniel's professional guests, 4 of them, seated at a table near the window, had been watching the confrontation unfold, with expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet fury. They had recognized Evelyn the moment she walked through the door. They had watched what happened. The most senior among them, a man named Thomas Webb, who served as Meridian's general counsel, had already stepped away from the table and was speaking in a low voice into his phone. He was speaking with the precision and economy of language that characterized every conversation he had when legal matters were at stake. Someone near the entrance was crying softly. It was not clear who. Richard Caldwell was still standing where he had been standing when the blow landed. He had not moved. He seemed to understand, in the way that people sometimes understand things they have been trying not to understand for a long time, that the world had shifted in a direction he could not reverse. He looked at his daughter's face. He looked at his son-in-law's face. He looked at the room full of people he had spent 40 years impressing, all of them, now looking at him with an expression he had never wanted to see directed at himself. The woman he had struck was watching him with eyes that held no contempt. That was almost the worst part. Contempt he could have worked with. What he saw instead was something quieter and more penetrating, the look of someone who had seen this before, in some form, in some room, on some day that had also turned out to be important, and who had learned to carry it without letting it bend her. He took one step toward her. His legs felt uncertain. He opened his mouth, and what came out was barely a word. Evelyn waited. "I didn't know," he said. It came out smaller than he intended. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. She looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was even and unhurried, and the room was so quiet that everyone heard every word. "What exactly," she said, "did you think you knew?" Richard had no answer. The question was not rhetorical, which made it worse. She continued, still in the same quiet register. "You saw a woman in an inexpensive dress walking into your family's event. You made a series of decisions based on that. And then you made another decision." She paused. "The last one is the one we need to talk about." Sophia had crossed the room and taken her father's arm. She was not supporting him so much as anchoring him, keeping him in place, which was what the moment seemed to require. She looked at Evelyn with an expression of open mortification. "I am so sorry," she said. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. "I am so profoundly sorry for what my father did. There is no—" She stopped. Started again. "There is no excuse." Evelyn looked at her carefully. "You didn't do anything," she said. "He's my father." "Yes," Evelyn said. "He is." Daniel had moved to stand beside Evelyn, not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, but simply by walking over and positioning himself there, the way people position themselves when they want to make clear where they stand. He reached out and took the envelope from her hands, and held it, carefully, as though he understood what it represented, and was not yet ready to process what it contained. Thomas Webb had ended his phone call, and was walking toward the center of the room with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who has decided that the time for patience has run out. He was a trim, silver-haired man in his early 60s, with the kind of face that was very difficult to read, and had been cultivated to be that way. He came to stand a few feet from Richard Caldwell, and he looked at him in the way lawyers look at people who have created significant problems. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "my name is Thomas Webb. I'm General Counsel for Meridian Technologies. Given what I witnessed this evening, I am formally advising you that you have committed a criminal act assault and battery against the Chief Executive Officer of a publicly traded company in front of more than 200 witnesses, several of whom recorded the incident on their phones." He paused, very briefly, to let that land. "I am here to inform you that Miss Brooks has several options available to her, including but not limited to a formal criminal complaint, a civil suit, and a corporate response that would have implications for all existing business relationships between Meridian and any entity associated with your name." He said it without emotion, the way he might describe the weather. "The decision is hers." The room had gone so still that the sound of the HVAC system was audible. Every eye moved to Evelyn Brooks. She was standing with perfect composure, the mark on her cheek fading slowly, her hands at her sides. She looked at Thomas and gave a single, measured nod. Then she looked at Richard Caldwell. She looked at him for what seemed, in the stillness of the room, like a very long time. Richard was not a man who had spent much time on his knees. He had kneeled at his daughter's soccer games when she skinned her knees. He had kneeled at his mother's grave. Both times, the act had cost him something. He felt it again now, the resistance of a pride that had been built over decades and had, in the course of one evening, been revealed as constructed on something very thin. He lowered himself slowly, one knee, then both, onto the marble floor of the Hartwell Grand Hotel ballroom, in front of his daughter, his son-in-law, and 230 people who were watching with the focused attention of witnesses to something they would not forget. "I am sorry," he said. His voice came out rough, abraded. "I had no right to treat you that way. No right at all." He stopped. He was not finished, but he needed a moment. He took it. "I looked at you, and I decided I already knew everything about you," he said. "I decided based on what you were wearing, and what you looked like, and what I assumed you were. I was wrong. I was completely wrong." His voice had dropped to something almost private, though the room was still listening to every word. "And I hit you. I hit you." The repetition had the quality of a man confronting something he could not fully believe about himself. "I have no excuse for that. There is no version of this where I can claim I had an excuse for that." Evelyn looked down at him. Her expression was not warm. Exactly, this was not a moment that called for warmth, but it was not cold either. It was something more complicated. The expression of a woman who had learned to hold the full reality of other people without reducing them to their worst moments or their best justifications. "Get up, Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly. He rose. He was breathing unevenly. She looked at him and said, "I have one question for you, not as a CEO, as a person." She paused. "If tonight had gone the way you intended, if no one had told you who I was, would you be sorry?" The question sat in the center of the room like an object everyone could see and no one wanted to touch. Richard opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought about all the things he could say about misunderstanding, about the stress of the evening, about the expectations of a father protecting his family's event, and he understood, with a clarity that was uncomfortable in its precision, that none of those things were answers to the question she had actually asked. He thought about the woman in the navy dress standing at the entrance to his daughter's wedding. He thought about what he had seen and what he had decided in the time it took to cross a ballroom. He thought about the phone call he would have made the next morning, describing the incident to his friends with the comfortable righteousness of a man who had defended his territory. He said nothing, because he had nothing to say that would not make it worse, and for possibly the first time in his adult life, Richard Caldwell understood that the honest silence was the only honest answer. Evelyn nodded slowly, as if this was also an answer, which, of course it was. She turned to Thomas Webb. "I won't be filing charges," she said, "and Meridian's existing business relationships will remain unchanged." Thomas Webb absorbed this without visible reaction, as he absorbed most things, and gave a brief nod. "However," she continued, and her voice remained even, but gained a quality of precision that made several people in the room straighten almost involuntarily, "I would like Mr. Caldwell to address this room, not as my apology, but as his own." She glanced at Richard. "Before this evening ends." There was a microphone stand near the small stage at the front of the ballroom, positioned for the toasts that were scheduled to follow the meal. Richard Caldwell walked toward it with the gait of a man who has been given a task he knows is right and cannot make himself want. He stood in front of it. He looked out at the room, at the tables of well-dressed people, at the hotel staff who had gathered near the edges, at his daughter in her wedding dress, at his son-in-law holding a cream envelope he had not yet opened. He thought about 40 years of building things. He thought about the specific, clarifying discomfort of being seen completely. He leaned toward the microphone. "I did something tonight that I cannot undo," he said. His voice carried across the room without amplification, but he kept his face close to the mic because the ritual of it seemed to matter. "I judged a person by the color of her skin, by the clothes she wore, and by what I assumed her presence in this room meant. I made that judgment in seconds, and then I put my hand on her." He paused. The silence was absolute. "I have spent my whole life believing I was a fair man, a man who built things honestly, who treated people with respect. Tonight showed me the distance between the story I tell about myself and who I actually am." His voice cracked not dramatically, but in the quiet way that voices crack when the person speaking has stopped performing and started telling the truth. "I am ashamed. Not because of who she turned out to be, but because of who I turned out to be." He stepped back from the microphone. He looked at Evelyn Brooks. He did not expect forgiveness, and he did not ask for it. He simply looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that the room could feel without being able to name. And then, from somewhere near the center of the ballroom, someone began to applaud. Not enthusiastically, not the theatrical, performed applause of a crowd being moved by spectacle, but slowly, deliberately, the way people clap when they are not entirely sure what they are clapping for, but understand that something true has just happened and silence would be wrong. Others joined. By the time 15 seconds had passed, the entire room was clapping, and a few people were crying, and the string quartet, after a brief, confused consultation, began to play something soft. Daniel Carter finally looked at the envelope in his hands. He opened it carefully. The way you open something you already suspect will change your life. He read the letter. He read the share certificate. He read the handwritten note. His face did something that was very hard to watch, because it was very honest, the expression of a man receiving something he had worked for without ever daring to expect it. He looked up at Evelyn across the room, and she met his eyes, and she gave him the precise, calibrated smile of a woman who does not smile carelessly and always means it when she does. "Thank you," he said. "It came out rough." "You earned it," she said. "You've always earned it." Sophia had taken her father's arm again, and this time it was not to anchor him. She was simply beside him, the way daughters stand beside their fathers when those fathers have stumbled badly and need to know that the stumbling has not ended everything. Richard put his hand over hers and kept his eyes forward, and it was the most human anyone in that room had seen him all evening. One of the guests, a woman in her 50s, who had been quietly recording the confrontation on her phone since the beginning, walked up to one of the Meridian executives and offered to share the footage. The executive listened, thanked her, and then said something that surprised her. He said that what was on her phone was her own to keep or delete, that Meridian had no interest in controlling the narrative, and that the evening would speak for itself without a clip attached to it. The woman thought about this for a moment, then put her phone in her clutch and did not take it out again for the rest of the night. The reception resumed. It was quieter than it had been before the doors had opened, a different quality of quiet, the kind that settles over a gathering when something real has happened, and everyone present knows that they will be telling this story for years, but that the telling will require care. The food was served. The toasts were given gentler, shorter, and more sincere than originally planned. Daniel danced with Sophia, and they moved across the floor with the particular tenderness of two people who have just navigated something difficult together and come out the other side still holding on. Evelyn Brooks stayed for exactly 1 hour longer than she had planned. She ate a plate of food at a small table near the window and spoke with several of the Meridian executives and a few of the other guests who approached her with the careful courtesy of people who are not entirely sure how to address someone they have just watched absorb a moment of profound injustice without losing their composure. She was gracious. She was not effusive. She was herself, which was, by most accounts, enough. She left before the cake was cut. She found her silver sedan in the guest lot, between the black Mercedes and the catering van that was now half empty, and being loaded back up by a crew of young workers in white jackets. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, looking at the stone facade of the Hartwell Grand Hotel, lit against the October dark. The mark on her cheek had faded almost entirely. She thought about what Richard Caldwell had said at the microphone. She thought about the question she had asked him. She thought about the silence that had answered it. She started the car and drove home. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through certain professional circles, in the way stories spread when they carry genuine weight, not as gossip, exactly, but as the kind of narrative that people pass along because they understand intuitively that it contains information worth having. Thomas Webb fielded 3 calls from journalists in the first week and declined all of them on Evelyn's instruction. The Meridian Communications team issued a single, brief statement confirming that no legal action had been taken and no business relationships had been affected. And that was the entirety of what the company said publicly about the matter. Richard Caldwell reached out to Evelyn's office the following Monday. He did not ask for a meeting. He did not make excuses. He sent a handwritten letter, 3 pages, in the slightly formal, slightly cramped cursive of a man who had not written by hand much in recent years, that said, among other things, that he had been awake for most of the previous week thinking about what he had done and what it meant, and that he intended to change something about the way he moved through the world, and that he did not expect her to care about that change, but that he felt he owed her the information. He asked for nothing in return. Evelyn read the letter twice, the way she had read Daniel's handwritten note, tucked into the back of a project report 3 years ago. She did not reply, but she kept the letter. Daniel Carter's promotion became official at the end of that month. He stood in front of the assembled Meridian leadership team and gave a short, clear-eyed speech about what the past 7 years had taught him. He did not mention the wedding. He did not reference the evening at the Hartwell Grand. He talked about building things that lasted, about the responsibility of trust, and about what it meant to work within a company that had chosen, at its founding and at every difficult crossroads since, to operate by the belief that excellence was not a credential you were born with, but a practice you maintained through every decision, including the ones no one would see. People in the room who knew what had happened the Saturday before listened with the attentiveness of people who understood that the speech was also about something else. Evelyn sat in the second row. She did not clap louder than anyone else. She did not make it about herself. She listened to Daniel speak and thought, as she occasionally allowed herself to think, that the work she was most proud of in her career was not the contracts or the growth metrics or the acquisition strategy, but the people she had helped become more fully themselves. After the meeting, she stopped briefly at the coffee station, poured herself a cup, and went back to her office. The day continued. There was a lot to do, as there always was. She sat down at her desk and began. 3 months after the wedding, Richard Caldwell attended a community business workshop at a civic center in the city's east side, an event organized by a nonprofit that worked with first-generation entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. He had contacted the organization after reading about them in a local paper. He had not told anyone he was going. He arrived early, set up folding chairs with the volunteers, and spent the afternoon listening to young entrepreneurs present business plans with the nervous, determined energy of people who are trying to build something real with very little. He offered feedback when asked. He was careful about how he offered it, more careful than he had ever been in any boardroom meeting, because he understood, in a way he had not understood 2 months ago, that these rooms required a different kind of listening. He came back the following month, and the month after that. The business event at the Meridian corporate campus in December was the first time he and Evelyn Brooks occupied the same room since the wedding. He saw her across the atrium, speaking with a group of industry colleagues, and he understood that crossing the room to approach her was not something he was entitled to do. He waited until the formal portion of the evening had concluded, and the gathering had loosened into small conversations, and then he walked toward her with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who has thought about what he would say if given this opportunity. She saw him coming. She did not move away. He stopped in front of her and extended his hand. She looked at it for one beat, not dramatically, simply as a person looks at something they are considering, and then she shook it. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Hers was the same. "Thank you," Richard said. He had rehearsed other versions of this sentence and discarded all of them, for leaving room for something different to happen. Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was not warm and was not cold and was not anything he had a convenient word for. "What are you doing differently?" she asked. It was the same directness she brought to boardroom conversations, to performance reviews, to every interaction where the truth was the only useful currency. She was not being unkind. She was simply asking the question that mattered. He told her about the workshops. He told her about what he had been reading. He told her about a conversation he had been trying to have with himself, imperfectly over the past 3 months, about the ways a person could be successful by every measure he had been taught to value, and still be profoundly wrong about things that mattered more. He said it without self-pity, and without the particular performance of growth that people sometimes engaged in when they wanted to be seen changing, rather than actually changing. He said it the way you say things when there is no angle you are playing, because you have run out of angles. Evelyn listened. She asked 1 or 2 follow-up questions, specific, practical questions about the workshops, about how they were structured, about what the entrepreneurs were working on. She did not offer absolution, because absolution was not hers to offer, and she knew it. She did not offer warmth beyond what was genuine. But at the end of the conversation, just before a colleague came to draw her back into another discussion, she said something quiet enough that only he could hear it. "The most expensive lesson isn't the worst thing you do," she said. "It's what you decide to do in the space that comes after it." She left him standing in the atrium with those words, and she walked back to her colleagues, and the conversation continued, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do. Richard Caldwell stood for a moment in the place she had left him, with the sound of the atrium around him and the December evening dark against the glass walls. He thought about a marble floor in October. He thought about a white envelope and a small wrapped gift, and a woman who had refused to be diminished by a room that had tried to diminish her. He put his hands in his pockets. He took a breath. He went and found himself a glass of water and joined the nearest conversation, and he listened more than he spoke, which was, for him, something new, and which was, he was beginning to understand, more important than most of the things he had spent his life saying. In the spring, Daniel Carter took on his first major assignment as Senior Vice President of Global Operations, the restructuring of Meridian's East African Partnership Network, a project that required him to lead teams across 6 countries and navigate a set of regulatory and cultural complexities that would have overwhelmed the project coordinator he had been 7 years ago. He threw himself into it with the focused, stubborn energy that had always been his greatest professional asset. He assembled his team the way Evelyn had taught him to Not by looking for people who were already confident, but by looking for people who became more of themselves under pressure. He was surprised, as he often was, by how much it worked. He called Evelyn once during a particularly difficult week, not to ask for help, but simply to report where things stood, the way you report to someone you trust and do not want to disappoint. She listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "You know what to do. Do it." He did. By the time the project concluded 8 months later, it had exceeded every benchmark set for it, and Daniel had built, in 6 countries, a network of local partnerships that the company would depend on for the next decade. At the internal review, Evelyn said very little, because very little needed to be said. The numbers spoke clearly. The people who had worked alongside Daniel spoke clearly. She closed her folder and looked at the room and said, simply, "This is what we're capable of." And then she moved to the next item on the agenda. Sophia had gone back to work full-time in the months after the wedding, running the small architecture firm she had founded 3 years earlier. She had grown up watching her father value people by what they appeared to own, and she had absorbed more of that than she liked to admit. The night of the wedding had cracked something open in her, in the way that certain events crack things open, not breaking them exactly, but letting air in where there had been none. She had begun having different conversations with clients, with collaborators, with the young architects who interned at her firm. She did not make a project of her own transformation. She simply paid more attention, which turned out to be, more often than not, the thing that was required. Evelyn Brooks was at her desk at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in April, when her assistant knocked and came in to say that she had a call holding from an executive she had been waiting to hear from for several weeks. She picked up the phone, and the conversation began, the way important conversations always began, which was to say it began in the middle of something larger that had started long before the call and would continue long after it. She listened, made a decision, confirmed it, and put the phone down. She turned back to her screen. There was a framed photograph on the far edge of her desk, the only personal item in an otherwise spare workspace of the original office above the laundromat in Chicago, taken by a friend with a disposable camera in the second winter she had slept on the cot. The office was small and bare, and lit by a single overhead bulb. In the photograph, Evelyn was 28 years old, seated at a folding table, looking directly at the camera with an expression of someone who has decided something permanent. She kept the photograph there, not as nostalgia, but as information. It reminded her what was real. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do in April, coming back to itself, loud and particular and full of its own ongoing story. She picked up her coffee. She read the next item in her queue. The story of the woman in the navy dress spread, in the way stories like that spread, until it became one of those things that people invoke in other contexts, in conversations about bias, about judgment, about what it means to walk into a room with an idea already formed about who belongs there and who doesn't. It was told differently depending on who was telling it. Some versions focused on the CEO, some focused on the father-in-law, some focused on Daniel or Sophia, or the moment when the string quartet began to play something soft over the silence of 230 witnesses. The version closest to what actually happened that October evening in the ballroom of the Hartwell Grand Hotel was the version that did not reduce any of them to a single lesson, but held the whole complicated shape of what had happened. A woman who drove herself to a wedding in a car she had owned for 6 years, a room full of people who had made decisions in seconds, a hand raised in anger, an envelope that changed hands, a microphone, a question that went unanswered, and the long, slow, imperfect work of choosing to be different than you have been. What remained, after all of it, was not a triumph, or a reckoning, or a simple moral. What remained was something quieter and more durable. It was the particular dignity of a woman who had walked into a room that tried to close against her and had refused, with extraordinary patience and without a single raised voice, to become smaller than she was. It was the specific, uncomfortable growth of a man who had encountered the truth about himself at a moment when he could not look away from it. It was a young couple beginning their shared life, with the knowledge that the life they were building together had been witnessed and shaped by something real. And it was the continuing, daily, unglamorous work of companies and people and rooms and conversations trying, imperfectly and inconsistently and without any guarantee of success, to deserve the people who walk through their doors. Dignity, it turned out, was not the absence of difficulty. It was not a condition that could be granted or revoked by another person's opinion, or preserved by expensive things, or proved by any credential that could be printed on paper. It was something you carried or you didn't. It was a practice, repeated every day, in the small moments where no one was watching, and the large moments where everyone was. Evelyn Brooks had known this for a long time. On an October evening in the Hartwell Grand Hotel, she had demonstrated it in front of 230 witnesses who had not expected to learn anything that night beyond the lyrics to the first dance song. Most of them went home, changed in ways they would not have known how to describe, but would spend years quietly acting on, in offices and families and conversations where the easier choice would have been to look away. Respect is never determined by appearance, wealth, or skin color. It is earned through character.